So today I am interviewing Amanda Skenendorf, who wrote The Second Life of Muriel West. And I have a video review of that, and I love that book. So I asked Amanda if she'd have a chat with me, and here she is. So Amanda lives in Las Vegas, and she has written 4 books, and her first novel won the American Library Association's Reading List Award for Best Historical Fiction. And I read that book too, and honestly, it is really an award winner. It totally deserved an award. So I guess that whipped your career along, that award. Would that be true?
I think it was definitely very, very helpful in sort of the trajectory of my career. You know, readers, and not just readers, but certainly people in the publishing industry, people, outside of the publishing industry that support books, libraries, independent bookstores, things like that. There's a lot to sift through, right? And so in the way that we might use an app to see which 5-star restaurant do you want to go to, as opposed to the 1-star restaurant. I think something like this award helps these people that are looking for books to put on their shelves.
Yes.
Okay, this one, the Library Association liked it, so maybe there's something to it.
Yeah, it helps you choose for sure. So you say on your website, in your about page, that you're lucky. You repeat that word a lot. How important was luck in you getting your publisher, do you think?
There was certainly an element of luck, for sure. I think that the backbone of any sort of most success is, the hard work, and even more so than that is the perseverance. But at the end of the day, you're trying to find an agent, a publisher, and a readership, all of whom, resonate with your work. And there's all kinds of things that can come into play very much outside of your control that affect that. Maybe an agent that you're just dying to have represent you has a book that is very, very similar, or a voice, an author with a voice very similar to yours, then maybe they're going to pass, even though it's not a comment about your writing, your manuscript. Yes. The same could be true for the publisher, or maybe, you just, I think people that somehow find their way into the beginning of a trend, right? There certainly is something to be said to kind of having a pulse on society's unconsciousness, if you will. But I think there's also something to be said for those people who, got on with the vampire trend, pretty early on, versus people that are trying to do it now. Or I have a friend, a fantastic writer, she's amazing. She wrote a book about a pandemic and was trying to get it to find an agent literally right as the coronavirus pandemic began. And there just was not an appetite for that at that moment, right?
At that time. Yes.
There won't be again. But that was that was an unlucky thing for her. So in that way, I think pieces aligning that my story, the first one, Between Earth and Sky, resonated with my agent and then resonated with my publisher. There was some luck to that.
Yeah, it's really timing, isn't it? And connecting with the right person.
Yes. Yeah.
So you've published all your books with Kensington. Do they nurture you in any way as an author?
They do, certainly, in that they give me a lot of freedom. My editor is very willing to just let me say, I want to write about this, and he's like, go for it, or in particular, because with historical fiction, one of the things that they tell you to do, the smart things to do, is to write in the same vein of something, right? So generally that means you're writing the same era. Sometimes that could mean I know someone who writes about France, and that's sort of her niche. Another friend of mine, she writes historical fiction. It's all about the Second World War, and it's all set in Hawaii. So she's got this great, very defining thing about this is what she writes. And they're wonderful books, and they sell really well. And I don't do that. I just hop all over the place into different eras, different places, kind of things with completely sort of different trajectories of the story. And I appreciate that my editor is willing to take a chance on that and not and not trying to pigeonhole me too much into one particular vein of historical fiction.
But you have a strong voice anyway, like your books all delve quite deeply into the themes that you're dealing with, and there's usually a social, well, you know, some sort of social theme. And
Yes.
so that connects your books. Well, how long were you writing before you got your agent?
It took me about just over 6 years of writing, you know, more or less full-time. I was working part-time, still working part-time as a nurse, but writing full-time for about 6 years before I found someone. And there were, you know, a couple of books and multiple queries within that time period, pitches, all sorts of things, a ton of no's before the proverbial yes.
So how many books did you write before you got one published?
I wrote one book. I have one book that is not published, probably won't ever be published. It's a little bit different. It was a historical fantasy novel, but it was incredibly helpful in many ways in that it helped me learn, I think, about story. And, you know, this is what, you know, you're looking for when you're thinking about your story arc and, you know, meeting certain story elements. And also, I think I had the very naive idea, right? I'm going to write a book and then I'm just going to sort of present it to the world and they're going to be like, oh, thank you. This is what we've been missing. So I wrote this book and then I joined a writer's group, read some of it to them, and I learned very quickly, like, oh, this book needs a lot of editing. And so that was a huge lesson for me at the beginning. And then I edited it some and did some querying because I realized, okay, I've got to learn, what is this business? How do you go about finding an agent and a publisher and these sorts of things? So I had to research about all of that, get my list of agents I wanted to query. And I had very little success in that with that first book. I got a few nibbles, but I was never getting requests for the full manuscript or anything like that. And that taught me something too, because I realized, okay, I've got to do more editing. This book is not good enough to attract an agent. But at that point, I had already started with kind of outlining Between Earth and Sky. And I just was so much more enamored with that book, with that story rather, that I said, okay, I'm okay putting this book aside, this first book aside, and really focusing on that. And I think one of the things that helped with Between Earth and Sky was that I was so attached to the story. I think there can be some danger in that, but it also helped me stick with it when I had people saying, you know, you've been working on this book a long time. Maybe you should try to write a different book. Maybe, you know, maybe this isn't the one either. And it felt like an important piece of American history that we weren't exploring. And so I think that really helped me stay the course, if you will, until, and of course, revise and revise and revise and revise until it finally got to that point.
Yeah, it is an important book, and not just in terms of history, but the way you look at the different cultural angles. You know, and I think that's really interesting. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you about that was, you know, you're obviously not Native American, so at least you don't look like a Native American to me. And yet you're writing the perspective from a completely different culture. So how do you make sure that you get that right?
That is such, I think it's a very delicate thing to do, but terribly, terribly important. It helps in this particular book that, you know, I'm not Native American, but my husband is, of course, his family is. So yes. Yeah, so I had, right, I was able to like go with him and we would go back to his reservation and we would meet with, you know, people on his cultural, you know, that work at the cultural center and visit the museums and talk to a language expert, and just having that ability to reach out and form connections with people from that culture, that was hugely important in understanding that perspective, I think. But beyond that, it was, you know, spending a lot of time researching the various cultures that I was using, because I talked about in this particular book several different Native American tribes, and you want to make sure that you are not lumping them all together as if there was sort of this pan Native American culture, when they all had distinct elements and practices and beliefs. And then I would say finally, I think, well, maybe two things. One, that you do have to understand that there is great risk in getting it wrong. Like I feel like authors can't just be flippant about writing from a different perspective, that we really have to understand that getting the details wrong hurts people, and people that have, already endured so much, right? So getting it right is incredibly important. And also, but approaching it from this perspective of the human element as well, understanding that there is incredible difference between people, but also that there are things that unite us as humans, and tapping into those elements and making sure that that is part of my characters as well, so that you get the full picture of these individuals.
So how did you learn to write so well?
Thank you. I appreciate the starting place of that question. It was a lot of, to be honest, self-study. I don't have a degree in writing, but when I decided, I really want to try this, I want to try to be a novelist, I spent a lot of time reading different books, different craft books. And I joined a writers group that was really, I think, instrumental in, again, just sort of helping me realize what I didn't know.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing, isn't it? You don't know what you don't know.
Right. Yes. Yes.
You really need somebody to tell you.
Yes. And this group was wonderful. And so, they helped guide me, and then I could see, like, okay, where am I deficient? And then I could go and find books or classes that speak to that specific issue. I attended several conferences and took classes. I'm still taking classes and doing that sort of thing, because I think, there's so much to learn. You never stop learning. You really have to treat, I think, writing as a craft, as an art form, that, just because I can put words on a paper, just because I know how to write, doesn't mean I know how to write a great story. Yeah. So having, I think, respect for the profession is important too.
Yeah, I totally agree. So when you're writing historical fiction, you have to be true to history. So obviously there's a lot of research involved. Could you just tell us about that process that you go through? And I guess I'm interested too in how history inspires the story, and how you work your story around the history. Can you talk about that a bit?
Absolutely. I think writers get inspired by different things. A lot of people will start with a character and then build a story around that character. For me, it is often little bits of history. So with Between Earth and Sky, it was, learning about the Native American boarding schools that the government had set up, and just being shocked by this new knowledge. And from there, that was sort of the starting place of my story. And so the same with The Second Life of Muriel West. I had no idea that there was this facility in Louisiana where for several decades, all of the other states would send people with leprosy, Hansen's disease, to this hospital / colony to be thankfully treated, but also completely isolated. And so I'll start with often stumbling upon something in history that just really strikes me, and that I, connect with, I think, on a emotional, a gut level, and then I know very little about it, right? So the first bit of research for me is pretty broad, and kind of understanding what is the larger historical context of this, small moment in history. And then as I'm learning about this more broad history, then I'm starting to just latch on to different ideas and different people that I want to sort of bring about into the story. So like with the Second Life of Muriel West, I was reading a lot of first person accounts, letters, and memoirs that people who had been there at Carville, this leprosarium in Louisiana, that they had written, and latching on to little themes of their stories or events that they had experienced, and almost like stringing them together to create a larger narrative. So then once I have maybe like a broad or general structure of the novel, kind of outlining, okay, now I've identified this is what my main character is going to be. This is sort of her general arc. And these are sort of the larger story elements. Then I'll write my first draft. And I try to do that really quickly because it's so easy to fall back into research mode. Like you'll get to this point and you think, well, okay, she's, for example, going into New Orleans. What was New Orleans like in the 1920s? And I might have to pause and do a little bit of research, but by and large, I try to postpone that until I'm finished, because I mean, Las Vegas, or not Las Vegas, but New Orleans in the 1920s, that is huge in and of itself. And it's so easy, especially because I love history, that I could spend weeks studying, New Orleans in the 1920s. And the risk of that is, what if I cut that scene, right? Like, what if I spent 2 weeks researching this particular thing, and then I decide like, that's no use in the novel? Then that's so much time wasted. So I do try to just put little markers in as I'm writing the first draft, maybe highlighting different things. And I know I need to go back and flesh this out, make sure that this makes sense within the time frame. And then, but I do that afterwards, so that for me, it's easiest to start editing when I have a full manuscript to go with. Like I can't really hold the story in my head completely until the first draft is done. And I need to be able to do that to start really editing in earnest.
Yeah, you got to get the story down.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think it's a balance of, it's very important, I believe, in writing historical fiction, that you're keeping with the historical record, because obviously I'm not writing nonfiction, so the reader knows this is a fictional book. But at the same time, I feel there's a contract that I've made with the reader. Like, I'm going to tell you a story, and unless I indicate otherwise, the elements of this are true. Like, I generally write about characters that I've made up in, kind of fictitious characters, but the whole backbone of the story is true. The events, the situations, the various forces that are coming to play, like that is all, insofar as we can, know the past. I will say that is true. And then it's letting the reader know when you do deviate from the historical record. But when I do err on the side of story over fact, I try to reference that in the author's note, just so that people are aware.
Your author's note's good. It's really nice as a reader to know that, to know what's really true, and where you diverge. Your next book is The Nurse's Secret, and you are a registered nurse. And are you still working part-time?
I am. I do infection prevention. Yeah.
So how much does your experience as a nurse, how much is that reflected in this book?
In some ways, very little, because thankfully, nursing 140 years ago is very different than nursing today. However, so like in terms of Una's day-to-day tasks, very little, I think, is influenced by what I did and have done as a nurse. On the other hand, there are definitely elements where that do come to play. So I always sort of found myself a little bit as a fish out of water in my nursing career, because I don't come from a family of nurses. It wasn't something like this childhood dream of, I'm going to be a nurse, and this is sort of a big part of my identity. It was something that I wanted to do, that I thought I would enjoy doing and be good at, and I just did it. I went to college and got that degree. And so Una's struggle, she also, in a very different way, because she's a thief, but she's also a fish out of water. So writing it from that perspective, I think, reflects my own feeling sometime about nursing. And then also there's a moment where Una, like, she realizes this impact that she's making on lives, people's lives, in a way that she never has done before. And there are moments very vivid I can think about, that happened over a decade ago in my early nursing career, where you just, in that way, nursing is infinitely rewarding, because you have this moment with another person in almost this intangible way where that you've made a difference. And that's an incredible feeling. So that comes to play in the story as well.
One thing, if you could say one piece of advice for an author, what would it be? Very quickly.
Don't give up. Just keep on persevering.
Yeah, jolly good. All right. Well, we're out of time. So Amanda, thank you so much for chatting. I found that really interesting. And good luck with your next book, and keep writing.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. I was really, really honored to be here. Thank you.